Today, it's my goal to get you out of your work boots and snow boots from shoveling this morning and into the sandals of a first century rabbi, which is not a place that you'd usually put yourself in. So I want you to dust off the prayer shawl and yarmulke, even though they didn't wear yarmulkes back then, right? And I want you to just be thinking through what it must have been like for a religious leader, a devout Jew, to become a Jesus follower in the first century and then be responsible for leading his flock to do the same, all the resistance. We're not just talking about somewhere in the kind of Israel borders or near Jerusalem, but think, for illustration's sake, the city of Ephesus. I've got a little map for you, and Ephesus is right near the middle. It's just across from the Greek peninsula in Asia Minor. It's a Greek city at this time because of the conquest of Alexander the Great, so they're Greek in culture, but there's lots of Jewish people there, huge Jewish population because of the northern kingdom going into captivity and various diaspora moments. There's lots of Jews, but there's also lots of Greeks. These are people who have very different worldviews. Think modern day, in some places, Republicans and Democrats, right? It's hard to get to some of the foundational issues because there's a big difference, at least in some places, in some ideologies. So imagine being a rabbi in a pagan city like Ephesus. You're responsible for leading your conservative Jewish flock, but also God-fearers who are coming in from a Greek background. And now you're not just leading them to the Old Testament narrative, but to Jesus Christ himself. How are you going to do that? How are you going to talk to both of those worldviews? How are you going to strike and find common ground? The only way you're going to move forward and be successful in that ministry location is if you can figure out shared stories, words that would perk up the ears of any person who hears them, not just Jew or Greek. You're going to have to get rival teams to play together. How do you do that? You change the game entirely. John writes his gospel likely from Ephesus. There's already Matthew and Mark and Luke circulating around. They tell the story of Jesus as the kind of the beginning and culmination of the Israel narrative. But John is speaking in a place where not everybody is familiar with the Israel narrative. Not everybody knows their Old Testament. Some do, and they're super devout, but others have no idea what's going on. How is he going to speak Jesus' truth to both of those groups of people? Such is the story today, because for a Jew, there is no Jesus figure that doesn't fill the messianic void that they expected in the New Testament era. And for a Greek to talk about Jesus as a man who is also God, that just blows their minds entirely, that doesn't fit all of the philosophies that they are used to. So we're going to have to come up with something different entirely. Matthew, Mark, and Luke expose what I call, and it's not just what I call, it's what the academia calls a Christology from below. They understand who Jesus is from his position of being born of man and coming up in Israel's story. Meanwhile, John starts from a different place. His is Christology from above. He's answering different questions. If you were writing a gospel, wouldn't you want to tell the story in a way that made sense to the people who sat in your seats in your synagogue? Answer the questions they were asking, not just the questions that people ask 200 miles away? This is what John is doing, and the brilliance starts in the first verse. John 1:1, you know it well. This is what it says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You see the difference of how this is framed? Think about this. It's in the beginning. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they start in different places. Mark starts with Jesus and John the Baptist right off the bat. Matthew wants to take you all the way back to Abraham to root Jesus in Israel's narrative. Luke, a little bit further back, he's got a wider audience. He wants you to see Jesus as the second Adam. John starts even before that. Not in the garden, not in the covenant ritual with Abraham, not when John the Baptist just starts speaking it in the first century. Shadows of Genesis 1:1. in the absolute beginning. We're not talking about just the story of humans or just the story of Israel or just the story of Jesus. We're talking about the story of all that was, all that is, and all that will ever be. Do you see the cosmic scope that John is starting with? And he does this using a word that means way more than just the words I'm speaking or a word that you'd read on a page. Because in the beginning there was something. Not just nothing, it's the word. Now, let me throw it up for you. I'm going to give you a Greek lesson. You've probably heard this before, but I want to give a little bit more of a just robust discussion to this. Logos, or logos, is the Greek word for word, and it means a whole lot more than just word. When a Greek person heard this, they thought of one thing. When a Hebrew person or a Jewish person heard this, they thought of another. See, in ancient Greek philosophy, you guys are getting ahead of me. In ancient Greek philosophy, the understanding of word was all over the map, what logos was, what it could be. In fact, some camps of philosophical thought weren't even sure if there was a word, if it was good or could be trusted. If there was a word, if we'd want to even know what it was. There was all sorts of confusion. But in a broad way, most Greek philosophers and just everyday Greek people would have thought of logos as roughly equivalent to reason. Reason in the abstract sense, okay? Bear with me just for a second. We're going to go out there. Okay? Reason is something we use, but it doesn't originate from us. Reason is something that we kind of need to get through our everyday life, but we don't control it. Reason is accessible to us, but outside of us. This is similar to how Greek philosophy thought of logos as a principle. It was impersonal, morally neutral, disaffected. It's not like it's a person who can be offended, okay? Think this way. Logic and math are things that humans use, but we don't control, okay? 2 plus 2 equals what? 4. Does 2 plus 2 not equal 4 if you don't want it to? No, like it always equals 4. Whether you want it to or not, whether or not humans even know how to use math or not, as a principle that stands outside of us, 2 plus 2 equals 4. So 2 plus 2 would equal 4 even if humans never existed. Take it one step further, this is where it gets right out there. 2 plus 2 would still equal 4 if there was no universe that was created. It's an abstract principle. This is how Greeks thought of logos. It's something out there, stands apart from us, but interacts with us. It's perceivable, but it's not personal. Are you tracking? Okay. Now, so when a Greek read that, they're like, ooh, we're about to get fancy in this book. I'm interested in what they've got to say. Now, if you're a devout Jew and you're reading this for the first time, you also have your ears perked up when you hear logos. Because in the Greek-speaking world, Jews liked to co-opt this understanding of reason and wisdom and personify their Old Testament narrative in God's law. So for them, logos was roughly equivalent to the Torah, God's revealed law for them, the do's and don'ts that God had revealed in the Old Testament narrative. This is what logos would have meant for them. And because God's law is from God who is from eternity and outside of time, then God's Torah would be with him even in the beginning. So the thing continues here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Math, logic, they don't go away whether or not there's a creation. So in a sense, it's with God. Torah, if it's God's revealed will, would be true whether or not it's written down on stone tablets or not. Way before it was given to Moses. In fact, I was nerding out on this earlier this week. There's a couple of contentious battles within rabbinical schools about how long the Torah existed with God before it was given to Moses. This is crazy. This is the stuff that people who have no attachment to reality talk about, okay? One religious school thought it existed for a little over 800 years. Another religious school thought it existed for over 1,800 years. Who cares? The idea is it comes from God, so it's with him in the beginning. So at all of the readers from various way extremes of thinking are reading this text saying, okay, in the beginning, I get the scope. the word logos, for whatever they wanted to think that was with God. I'm tracking. But here's one that's complicated. The word was God. That's where everyone's like, woo, full stop. I was on board. It made sense before. I was on board. But how could an impersonal force of reason be like God? Like, we do math, but surely God isn't math, right? And we can venerate and appreciate God's revealed will to us in his law, but surely God's law isn't equal to law. See, John's changing the playing field here. He's changing the game entirely. And people they're on their hook, line, and sinker. What could this possibly mean? In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So everyone's confused, just like you. They're like, why would this even matter? What should we glean from all this information? Well, he's going to continue to elaborate. Verse 2 says this: he was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that's been made. In him was life. What are we hoping for? Life. And that life was the light to all mankind. How do we figure out where life is if we don't know where it's at, right? We need an illuminating force. In him was light, and that life was the light of all mankind. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, before we continue, I want to dive back into the deep end, just for a minute, with some of the first century thinking of the day. Because most camps of Greek philosophy thought the Logos had ordering power. So it could be with God in the beginning, and it was a creative force. In fact, some camps of Greek philosophy thought the Logos was what actually created and sustains the universe. Now, there was difference about whether or not it was a good thing or a bad thing. Some people thought that was a bad thing because it's only good to be immaterial in spirit alone. So anything that would create matter could be bad, but whatever. That's not what we're getting at here. Continuing on, in the Old Testament, Torah was personified as wisdom, and according to Solomon, wisdom has been with God since the beginning. So everybody's tracking here, okay? With God in the beginning, it has creative purposes. I can see it, I can understand it. Also, in Greek thought and Judaistic thought, life was all that mattered. According to a Jew, where do you find life? Let me answer the question. In God's law. There's only one way to God's life-giving presence. Through the do's and don'ts that he revealed to Moses and people have been following on forever. For when you're searching for life in the Greek worldview, where do you find it? Well, they only thought life could be found through using reason to figure out what the meaning of life was. But how do you figure out the path to life if you don't know where you're supposed to be looking? So light and life have a whole lot of importance here. 2 weeks ago, on a Friday night, I was driving a practicing psychiatrist from West Lafayette from the airport back home. We had a fairly robust conversation the entire time that we were driving. It was fun. We got to the point, though, where it was completely overrun by politics, as kind of happens, right, when you have a conversation with a stranger. Luckily, I'm a fairly neutral body when it comes to that discussion. I can inhabit both spaces. Anyway, she was talking about how this was right during the transition, of how she's just so concerned about the state of humanity, right? Based on all that's happening and who's getting elected and who's leaving and the Capitol riots and all of this stuff, she's just like, I'm way more pessimistic than I've ever been. And she is somebody who her entire life has believed that education is the source of life. It is the light, and it is the only way that we're going to teach people the real purpose of living and allow people to get along, right? So if we just educate everybody, if everybody gets a strong liberal arts education, then we'll all be really modern people, and we'll all agree with one another and live and let live, and everything will be fine, right? She was arrested in the 60s for protesting wars and stuff. Like, this was her entire line of thinking. But she also is the psychiatrist for a couple of professors at Purdue. And she was talking about, man, some of these people are kind of in the QAnon conspiracy stuff, and it's all wonky. So she's looking at an educational institution, which in the modern mindset is this beacon of light, right? It's the hope. We just educate everybody. And she's seeing a generation of people who aren't becoming what she wants them to be through the educational process. She's seeing people at the top of the academic pedigree who are not embodying the principles that she thinks should be taught. And so she literally says to me out loud, if education isn't the answer for humanity, then what is it? We're all searching for life, and we need light to find it. Luckily, life and light has come into the world that he created. And if we find him, we will find all that we've ever been searching for. It turns out somebody had the inside scoop. John continues, see, God sent a man, John the Baptist, to tell about the light, so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. And John himself, though, not the light, don't get confused. He was simply a witness to tell you about the light. The one who is true light, the one who gives light to everything, was coming into the world. You see, everything you ever hoped for, ever needed, ever longed for, has come in the person of Jesus. But there's a really, really sad twist to the story. John reveals it in one line. He came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He even came to his own people, and they rejected him. I forgot to bring it today. I intended to. There's some evil people in my relational orbit who think it's a good idea to buy my children flashlights. Here's looking at Amber and Shayna. So on a regular basis, usually daily, I'm unintentionally or intentionally blinded by one of these flashlights, because they don't make the crappy ones that they used to with the batteries that shook around that you couldn't even see 3 feet in front of you. They're all LED. They can light up a wall. And so Amber bought a couple that are like horses or unicorns. You push a button, the mouth opens up, and it makes a fun sound like, and then shines a light. It's a really terrible sound when you hear it 10 times in a row and you've been blinded a couple of times, right? Like, no one likes to have a flashlight shined in their eyes. Anybody in the room like that? It's terrible. It wakes you up from whatever fog you're in, and you get this, it's an implanted white spot that you can't get rid of for like 10 minutes, right? It's just terrible. Let me tell you the truth. Humanity doesn't like having the light shined on us. We say we want the light, but we want to settle for dimmer options. Like, it's like when you were a kid, right? I've been there. I lived in a dark basement. I didn't keep the lights on. I'd watch TV in the dark. You ever did that? And so I'd be so focused on that. It's so dark around you that when my mom would come in and flick on the light or pull the string, and there was actually a pull string in the middle of my room. We were fancy. You'd be like, right? It's temporarily blinding. You don't like it. You probably would say, Mom, turn it off, right? We want to focus on the low lumen TV, the other distractions of our life, but light has come into the world. He's burst on the scene. He's showing us all that we really need. And we say, can you turn that thing off? I'm focused here. I'm busy. I've got my own priorities. I've got other things that I think are my guiding light. Turn that thing off. This is the sad truth about our situation. Like, we say we want the light. God, give us the light. Show us your glory. Show up and do something. And then he shows up and we just run back to our dark cave. I worked at Subway in high school, and there was a Chinese buffet right next to us. And so they just had insane amounts of trash. And rather than walking it out to the dumpster anytime they had a box or a bag, they would just stack it outside of their back door. So I would have to burst open our back door and switch on a light and walk my trash out. And when I'd open the door, there'd be 8 million cockroaches right there trying to eat all of their stuff. I know, don't you want to go to a Chinese buffet after service today? And the light would turn on, they'd pause for a second, and then they'd scatter, right? We do the same thing. We like to think we don't. It's exactly what we do. We want to trust in other things. We think there's safety in the darkness. We think there's safety in numbers in the darkness. We think if we can come up with our own little dim lights to distract people, like the moth going to the stupid little dingy light outside your house rather than being tracked by the moon. That's what it's supposed to do, by the way. Moths are supposed to fly by the lunar orbit, get where they're going because of the light of the moon. But when they get around houses, they come and they ding up against your light because they're distracted by the wrong thing. It's not the real light. It's not their purpose. It's not their meaning. The wrong light. We need the true life and the true light. And he has come into the world. The sad thing is, most of us just want to go back in the darkness, but there's hope. Because it's not just bad, end of the story. He came, you killed him, you suck, right? That's true. He came, you killed him, say you're sorry. That's what we need to do. But for those of us who are willing to do that, be distracted by the light, blink a few times to get acclimated to it, turn off the TV and do what we're supposed to do. Stop being distracted by the flashing light outside the house. For those who are able to do that, listen to this. Verse 12, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children not born from natural descent. It's not just the human story, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The only person who can do that, by the way, is the one who was there in the beginning, for whom and through whom all things were created. He has come to recreate you, to give you life through light. Now, when you're reading this in the first century, if you're a devout Jew, you're going insane because you're thinking Torah is life. And if you're a Greek speaker, you're thinking like the passions that consume me, they direct me to what the purpose of life is. Not a specific light, not a thing, not a person. So they're probably thinking, John, will you just stop, skirting the issue? Will you be direct? Will you just tell us what on earth is going on here? Because so far you've been talking about logos and we don't even know what you mean yet. And you've been using the word he, but you haven't told us who he is. Because you and I know, even in our modern world, let alone the ancient world, we like to personify things that mean like a lot to us. So they could still be thinking that he just really loves this logos thing. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a person who did a work to save us. So I imagine John's thinking, okay. Fair. We've been fairly poetic so far. Let me be really, really direct. See, the Word who was with God in the beginning and who was God, the one who is light and life, that Word, verse 14, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And you've seen his glory. The light has come on. You've seen his glory. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. You've even had witnesses, and you have in your life as well. John testified about him, crying out, saying, this is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me will surpass me because he was before me. Out of the fullness, out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of the grace that was already given. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth, what you really need, came through Jesus Christ. No one's ever seen God, but the one and only Son who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, and he has made him known to us. John couldn't be much clearer to his first century audience. For those Jews who were looking for everything in the Torah, he said this, look, you're looking for life in words. Literally words on paper. But the Word has become flesh, and he is life. Look at him. You think you can only get to God through obeying the law. But the Word himself has come in the flesh. Obey him instead. That's where you need to look for life and light. And to the Greek, he's saying, look, you think that reason is your guiding light. How has that worked out for you so far? Joke's on you. Reason has a name. His name is Jesus. Follow him. Stop trusting in your own abilities. You'll never find life apart from the source. See, in the beginning, God challenged the darkness. Remember this in Genesis 1? By speaking light into existence. The disturbing thing is darkness crept its way back in through our human sin, right? Jesus' arrival in the incarnation is God's second let there be light. He's come. He's made it plain. He's available. He's full of grace and truth. Grace on top of grace. Come back to him. See, in the Genesis story, the peak, the climax, the apex is when God creates man. But John 1 tells us there's a bigger story here, a grander apex, a different point of God's plan. See, the top mark is not God creating humans. It's God choosing to become one himself in Jesus. God's goal has always been to dwell with his people. In Jesus, he makes a way for you to come home. So why do you keep running to the darkness? He is your light, and he is your life, and he is here, ready to receive you today. See, this mixed bag of people in the first century rabbis' orbit needed an illustration to understand that Jesus is all in all that ever was, all that ever is, and all that will ever be. He is the only way to life and light. We need that same help in our 21st century world because we are more distracted than ever. We think we're better than them. Poppycock. You see it. All of the distractions, all the things claiming to be the light, all the things that are drawing your heart saying, I will be life-giving. Stop it. Jesus is the only light of the world. The only way back to God's life-giving presence. So stop searching for another way.